Chapter 2, over 2 years earlier. The three of us were at the family dinner table. Sarah and my mother had been arguing over Sarah's newly purple hair, and in grim silence, my mother passed me the green beans. At that moment from the basement, at least it sounded like it was from there, came a faint thud. We all looked at each other. It was as if my father was down there in his music studio and had given his bass drum a single tap. But my father was on the road again, had been for weeks. "What was that noise?" Nat asked. She cocked her head. It didn't sound again. From our chairs, we glanced about the dining room and through the windows. "Maybe something fell," I said, and took advantage of the moment to slide the beans toward Sarah without taking any for myself. "Is the security system on?" my mother said, turning to me. Before my father left on the new tour, he had a top-of-the-line home security system installed. "So you'll feel better," as he put it. "Yes, it's on," I said. "You haven't been fooling with it again, have you, Miles?" "No," I said, annoyed. I thought motion sensor technology was cool, and soon after it was installed, I couldn't resist taking a peek inside the main power unit. Just a few tiny Phillips head screws was all it took. Trouble was, within 4 minutes, a rent-a-cop car with flashing lights and 2 security guards inside came speeding up the driveway to the house. I was impressed. The guards were not, nor was my mother. "Maybe there's someone down there," Sarah said, her blue eyes widening. "There's no one in the basement," I said. I made a show of slouching up from my chair and clumping down the long stairs. It was the least I could do for my mother. And, as everyone knows, clumping one's feet is always important when it comes to weird noises in the basement. The downstairs still felt strange. All my father's musical equipment, including his big trap set with all its drums and cymbals, the stuff I'd grown up with, was missing. The space down here was always too big, but now it looked like an empty gymnasium. I walked around, even rattled open a couple of closet doors. "Dad?" I said softly. There was only silence. "Nobody there," I announced as I reemerged upstairs. "Told you so." Sarah let out a huge sigh of relief. Even though she dressed as dark and as scary as she could get by with, she was still a little girl. "Thank you, Miles," Mother said. I shrugged. We went on eating. Later, after dinner, as Sarah and I cleaned up the kitchen, my mother called our names, loudly. She was in the den watching the news on television. Sarah and I stared at each other, then hurried in. "Look," my mother said. A banner scrolled across the bottom of the screen. "Washington State has been rocked by major volcanic eruptions. It is confirmed that on February 10, 2006, at 6:13 p.m., Mount Rainier exploded with cataclysmic force, with a death toll in the hundreds in the Tacoma-Seattle area. Massive amounts of ash continue to spew into the air. Details to follow." "Those volcano people have been predicting this for months, but I never really thought it would happen," my mother muttered. She rapidly surfed through the channels. CNN was first on the story, but just barely. The anchorwoman with the long face and big hair was speaking in fragments as she listened to a voice in her earpiece. "Major seismic event, massive eruptions, Mount Rainier in Washington State, perhaps Mount Adams as well, plus several small ones in between, bigger than any of the volcanology forecasts. Like a string of firecrackers," she continued. "Up to 50 times bigger than Mount St. Helens." "St. who?" I asked. "Mount St. Helens," Sarah said immediately. "You know, Washington State." She didn't include her usual, "if you just read for once, Miles." That was her other, younger self. Lately, she read only trashy vampire-type fiction. "I have friends in Seattle," Nat said softly, as if to herself. "I know people there." She clicked rapidly through the channels. I stood there for a couple of minutes, but no details followed. I'd heard so much, for years it seemed, about seismic activity in the Cascade Range that it was like old news, like a movie with so much pre-publicity and so many television trailers that it feels like you've already seen it. Why go to the theater? I eased toward the front door. "Miles hasn't filled the dishwasher," Sarah said. "Fill the dishwasher, Miles," my mother said automatically. I glared at Sarah and headed back to the kitchen. I was only half finished when my mother called us again. Children, you should really see this. I sighed, Sarah hurried off, and I followed at my own pace. On the big screen, Sony, a column of ash rose up straight up like a gray broccoli stalk, growing even as we watched. Everything below and around it was flat and gray. My God, my mother murmured. Mount Rainier really is gone. Sarah plopped down and leaned her purple head toward the screen. Close-up images showed a forest tipped over like an exploded box of toothpicks. The scene switched to a suburb of Tacoma. In the edge of the mudslide, cars were washed up in jagged rows, like leaves in a gutter after a rainstorm. Sarah suddenly sucked in her breath and whirled around. Dad, where's he playing right now? I hadn't heard her call him Dad for a long time. East Coast, Boston area, my mother said quickly. She touched Sarah's hair. He's fine, not to worry. Sarah brushed off her hand and returned her gaze to the television. There were scenes of crushed houses and rescue workers running around like crazy. It was a first responder's dream come true. That and a great opportunity for documentary filmmakers. I loved those programs with names like Nature's Fury and Savage Earth. I watched bulldozers carefully uncovering cars. There were people still in them, some alive, some not. Do you think we'll have school tomorrow? I asked. Both my mother and Sarah turned to stare at me. Why wouldn't you have school tomorrow? My mother asked. I shrugged. Just wondering, I mumbled. It was the kind of dumb question that kept getting me in trouble in ninth grade that year. Sarah laughed at me, then turned back to the screen. By the way, your purple hair looks stupid, I said. The next morning in school, we were sent to our advisor pods rather than our first hour class. There, in small groups, we watched continuing coverage of the Cascade eruption, as it was already being called. All the anchor people, Peter Jennings, Joey Chen, Wolf Blitzer, Nancy Rodriguez, were out of their offices and at the scene. But old Dan Rather had them all beat. He was dressed in combat gear, green fatigues, army helmet against falling pumice stone, goggles, and a major dust mask that made his face look like a grasshopper's head. He breathed heavily, like Darth Vader, as he moved through dust and smoke. Pausing before a leg poking out of the mud, he wheezed, Vietnam, the Gulf War, I've been there, but nothing compares to this. We all laughed, except Mr. Worthing and a few science types and junior knowledge bowl geeks who watched the big screen with their mouths hanging open. Mr. Worthing turned to us. His face looked strange, too white. I have a cousin who lived near Tacoma. We're pretty sure he's dead. And then he turned back to the screen. The room was quiet. We all looked at each other. Leave it to a teacher to ruin a good time. Nathan Dale Schmidt, a skinny kid with yellow dreads, pushed out his lower lip and made the sign of the cross. We all cracked up, but silently. Math question, Miles, Mr. Worthing said without looking. I can't tell you how I hated the man when he did that. Mount Rainier is gone, vaporized. If it was approximately cone-shaped, with a height of 2.65 miles and a base radius of 6 miles, how much volume would that be? I had the usual two options, act dumb and lie, or be smart and look like a geek. The formula popped quickly into my head. 1/3 pi r squared h. And if you had the formula, the rest was easy. Sometimes I wished I had recall like normal people. When I was small, at home, we played a card game called Memory. Dozens of little animal cards were dealt face down, and then we took turns drawing two and trying to make pairs. I beat everybody, kids and adults, every time. Memory boy, my parents called me. Now I scrunched up my face and crunched the numbers. About 100 cubic miles, boss, I said. There were giggles about the room over the boss part. 100 cubic miles. And that's just one of the mountains, Mr. Worthing said. He didn't take his eyes off the screen. We continued to watch the ash rising from the crater of the former Mount Rainier. Talk about boring. The ash cloud billowed up as gray and repetitious as a screensaver designed by a dropout from COBOL 101. The newscasters hyperventilated over the same stuff. Ash plume will soon reach the stratosphere, about 9 to 12 miles above the Earth, and begin to disperse into the jet stream and possible wide-reaching implication for global weather patterns. Mr. Worthing? I asked. Yes, Miles. Shouldn't we get out of school for this? Why is that, Miles? Mr. Worthing said without looking. I mean, it's a national event of tragic proportions. I think our school administration will hold that it's very important to carry on in times like these. Don't you agree, Miles? I'm not sure, sir. At least Mr. Litsky should cancel our oral history project. There was a chorus of agreement. The dreaded oral history project was supposed to start today in social studies. I didn't mind the ninth grade science project, but I hated anything to do with reading and writing, and in this case, old people. We should study volcanoes instead, someone called. I'm sure Miss Guilfoyle will be happy to talk about volcanoes in your science class, Mr. Worthing said. Discussion lagged. The newscasters continued to quack on. There were scenes of bodies being dug up from the mud. I felt some pressure to make a move. Mr. Worthing, I said. He sighed. Yes, Miles. Watching this is making me very sad. I'm experiencing feelings of anxiety and grief. There were snickers. Mr. Worthing detached his gaze from the screen and slowly turned to me. I kept a straight face. I don't think I'm coping well at all, Mr. Worthing. All those dead people. Can I go to the counselor and talk to someone about feeling sad? More snickering across the room. Mr. Worthing pursed his lips. I could see he was disappointed in me, which made me feel terrible. But I couldn't back out now. Once you begin a move, even a stupid one, it's terminal not to follow through. Yes, Miles, of course. If you think you need professional help, then you should have it. There were hoots of laughter, on Mr. Worthing's side this time. He scribbled a pass. Get out of here, he said. His gaze cut right through me, and then he turned back to the screen and its unending geyser of ash. I made a triumphant exit, slapping hands here and there, and then I stood outside in the long, empty hallway. For one last laugh, I peeked back through the little rectangular window of the classroom. My friends had already turned away. I watched them for a while, but no one looked my way again, so I plodded along the rows of battered lockers toward the counselor's office. I handed my pass to the secretary. Hello, Miles, she said cheerfully. They were always so cheerful here. A couple of losers, one with long hair, the other with a shaved head, stared at me from the battered chairs and couches. Hey, I said. Hey, they replied, and looked away. I took a seat and paged through a Teen Esteem magazine. The pages were thick and gummy to the touch. All the pictures were defaced. The cheerful, handsome teenagers had poked out eyes, extra genitals, and rude dialogue boxes added. I sighed. I wondered what was going on back in my advisor pod. After a while, the losers were called inside, and soon Mr. Montroy Jones appeared. What say, Miles? I nodded. This way, kid. I was glad it was him. Mr. Jones was a huge black guy who scared everybody but me. He had once been in prison, but then was born again or something. He still had lots of bad tattoos, which he kept to remind him of his stupid days, as he called them. He was the nicest adult in the school. He scanned my pass as we entered his office. Feelings of anxiety and grief over the volcano, Miles? I nodded. He closed the door. We settled into our chairs. I tried to put on a sad face. I have a cousin who might be dead, I said. He stared at me, then slowly wadded up my pass and made a perfect shot through the tiny basketball net clamped on his wastebasket. So, Miles, your old man's still on the road with Shawnee Kingston. I shrugged. Yeah. Next time he plays in Minneapolis, you think he can get me tickets? I stared. Kidding, Miles, he said. Kidding. He tipped back in his chair and laughed hugely. I smiled. It was funny. Kind of. In second hour science, Miss Audrey Guilfoyle was pumped. She was one of those younger teachers who tried to identify with her students. I found this annoying, but at least she was lively and always had interesting facts. The Cascade eruption is not the first in the world, gang. In fact, dig this. She talked and passed out a sheet. Way back in AD 79, there was the huge eruption of Mount Vesuvius near Pompeii, Italy. But everybody knows about Vesuvius. As she went on about it nonetheless, I scanned the handout. Iceland, 1783, Skaptar Jökull volcano, hundreds of deaths. And the following years, 1783 to 84, were unusually cool. A dry fog hung over the land, cutting off incoming sunlight. Rays collected in a burning glass would scarcely kindle brown paper. Benjamin Franklin. This material comes from a great book called Ring of Fire by author David Ritchie, Miss Guilfoyle said. It's available in the library. Anybody know where the library is? There were a few distracted chuckles. Most everybody was actually reading. Indonesia, 1815, Tambora volcano. It sent 36 cubic miles of rock ash into the air. The following year, 1816, became known as the Year Without Summer. Eastern Canada experienced such a poor harvest that starvation became a significant cause of death among low-income families. France and Britain were plagued by crop failures, and in some parts of Europe, the populace was reduced to eating rats, cats, dogs, and anything that would fit into a pot. Does this mean we're going to have to eat our pets? Dara Jameson asked. There was laughter. She was very weird, always dressed in black and purple, the kind of girl my sister thought was cool. This is a volcanic incident, Dara, not a Stephen King novel, Miss Guilfoyle said. Be sure to tell your dogs and cats and hamsters they're safe. I read on. Indonesia, 1883, the Krakatoa eruption. Although it killed thousands, the most striking effect had to do with the air. Much of the material blown into the atmosphere by Krakatoa was exceedingly fine. The volcano acted like a giant grindstone during its eruption. Bits of pumice lifted easily into the air and spread around the earth, wafted along by the jet stream. World climate cooled perceptibly all through the 1880s. Miss Guilfoyle softly drummed her fingers as the class read. Some students moved their lips and were still on paragraph 1, but she couldn't wait. I liked that about her. Let's jump ahead to 1980, she said. Washington State and the Mount St. Helens eruption, also on the Cascade Range. Its gray cloud turned noon to midnight. Ash, the consistency of confectioner's sugar, piled up in the streets of Yakima, Washington, and other towns. Some could be bulldozed away or scraped off rooftops or shoveled out of the way, but most had to be hosed away. This put severe strain upon water supplies and sewage systems. Several small towns were almost totally buried. There was silence. Aren't bodies totally preserved in the ash? Dara said. People groaned. She's obsessed with dead bodies, someone called out. Dara didn't hear. Like at Pompeii, people can be dug up almost 2,000 years later and still have their eyelashes, she added. There were louder groans. Not sure about the eyelashes, Dara, Miss Guilfoyle said easily, but we'll definitely see the effects of the Cascade blast even here in the Midwest. First, we'll probably start to notice some haze and more intense sundowns and sunups. Not that any of you have seen a sunrise recently. There was laughter, and science class rolled on. Dara whispered to me, I still think we're going to have to eat our pets.